Hello everyone, my name is Lacey Boxell and I will serve as the moderator for today's debate. My teammates are Felicia Jansen, Isabel Kang, Dan Kulig, and Mike Reed. We will be discussing zero tolerance policies in schools. School-wide positive behavior support plans will also be discussed as an alternative practice. We will discuss the ethical and practical aspects of each policy in a formal debate structure. I will serve as the stater, and Dan will serve as both the prover and the attacker for the zero tolerance side. The school-wide positive behavior support side will consist of Felicia Jansen serving as the stater, Mike Reed as the prover, and Isabel Kang as the attacker. I will now provide you with an overview of zero tolerance policies in schools. West's Encyclopedia of American Law defines zero tolerance as the policy of applying laws or penalties to even minor infringements of a code in order to reinforce its overall importance and enhance deterrence. The Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994 was passed to ensure the safety of America's youth while they're in school. The act states, each state receiving federal funds under any subchapter of this chapter shall have in effect a state law requiring local educational agencies to expel from school for a period of not less than 1 year any student who is determined to have brought a firearm to school or to have possessed a firearm at a school under the jurisdiction of local educational agencies in that state. Since that time, many schools have adopted zero tolerance policies that go beyond expelling children who have brought firearms to school. Policies have been extended to address violence, threats of violence, drug use, bullying, sexual harassment, and other behaviors that have been found to hinder learning and decrease safety in schools. While zero tolerance policies may seem harsh, their purpose is to ensure safety, so strict guidelines are necessary. A survey conducted by the CDC found that in 2014, approximately 9% of public school teachers had received threats from students, and 5% were physically attacked by a student. The CDC also states that 20.2% of students who were surveyed reported that they had been victims of bullying while on school property during the previous year. This behavior is not conducive to a productive learning environment and must be addressed quickly and consistently. This allows schools to prevent further violence by removing students who engage in these behaviors before more serious infractions are committed. Beyond the threat of physical harm, psychological harm can result from an unsafe learning environment. According to the CDC, exposure to youth violence and school violence can lead to a wide array of negative health behaviors and outcomes, including alcohol and drug use and suicide. Depression, anxiety, and many other psychological problems, including fear, can result from school violence. It is unethical to expose our children to unsafe learning environments that could result in lifelong issues. The National Center for Educational Statistics, or NCES, provides us with information regarding the safety of our school systems since the implementation of the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994. These findings suggest that zero tolerance policies correlate with an overall decrease in victimizations at school. I will now show a graph that depicts these findings. Zero tolerance policies have effectively reduced the percentage of victimizations in schools. This includes violent victimizations and serious violent victimizations. As you can see, the percentage of students who have been the victim of theft have also gone down significantly since the increased implementation of zero tolerance policies. I believe that this is because zero tolerance policies provide students with clear expectations as well as clearly defined consequences for their behavior. We can't expect young children to make sound judgments without clearly defined expectations being set for them. Students are deterred from ever violating the policy because they know that there is a clearly outlined consequence that will be applied to them. Zero tolerance policies Also ensure that students are treated equally and held to the same standard. When any violation of the policy is made by a student, the consequence is universal, regardless of circumstance, and this prevents any claims of favoritism and ensures the fair treatment of all students. We will now hear from Felicia about positive behavior supports.
Hi everyone, I'm Felicia and I'm the stater for the school-wide positive behavioral support. I'm going to start off by giving a little background information on the intervention. So what is school-wide positive behavior support and how did the intervention come about? Although initially established to disseminate evidence-based behavioral interventions for students with behavior disorders, the National TA Center on PBIS shifted focus to the school-wide behavior support of all students and an emphasis on implementation practices and systems. As a result, PBIS is defined as a framework for enhancing the adoption and implementation of a continuum of evidence-based interventions to achieve academically and behaviorally important outcomes for all students. School-wide behavior support is a proactive approach to establishing the behavioral supports and social cultural needed for all students to achieve social and emotional and academic success. Attention is focused on creating and sustaining 3 tiers. These 3 tiers are the primary, secondary, and tertiary systems of support. The following diagram illustrates the multi-levels approach offered to students. Tier 1, also sometimes referred to as universal support or primary prevention, prevents the development of new problem behavior by implementing high-quality learning environments for all students and staff across all settings. Tier 2, also sometimes known as targeted supports or secondary prevention, reduces the number of existing problem behaviors that are presenting high-risk behaviors or for students who are not responsive to primary intervention practices by providing more focused, intensive, small group-oriented response in situations where problem behaviors are likely. Tier 3, or the tertiary tier, reduces the intensity, frequency, and/or complexity of existing problem behaviors that are resistant and/or likely to be addressed by primary and secondary prevention efforts by providing most individual responsive in situations where problem behavior is likely. In the past, school-wide discipline has focused mainly on reacting to specific misbehavior by implementing punishment-based strategies, including reprimands, research has demonstrated the effectiveness of school-wide positive behavior support in addressing the challenges of behaviors that are dangerous, highly disruptive, or impede learning and result in social or educational exclusion. School-wide positive behavior support has been used to support the behavioral adaptation of students and other individuals with a wide range of characteristics, including developmental disabilities, autism, emotional and behavioral disorders, and even students with no diagnostic label. In addition to being proven effective, student-wide positive behavior support is also the only approach to addressing behavior that is specifically mentioned in the law. Congress' reasons for encouraging the use of school-wide positive behavior support are clear and stem from 2 things: the historic exclusion of individuals with disabilities based on unaddressed behavior, and second, the strong evidence base supporting the use of school-wide positive behavior support. In the past, school-wide discipline has focused mainly on reacting to specific student misbehavior by implementing punishment-based strategies, including reprimands, loss of privileges, office referrals, suspensions, and expulsions. Research has shown that the implementation of punishment, especially when it is used inconsistently in the absence of other positive strategies, is ineffective. Zero tolerance policies impose automatic and harsh discipline for a wide range of student infractions, including nonviolent disruptive behavior, truancy, dress code violations, and insubordination. Even when school policies don't impose automatic suspension for behavior, a culture of overzealous inclusion from school that is fostered by the zero tolerance mindset has created a situation in which children are being removed from school for increasingly minor issues. There are many personal stories where zero tolerance procedures have been taken too far. For example, there is multiple students where were suspended because their parents packed a butter knife in their lunchbox. There are many points we are going to discuss that convey the benefits of PBIS in comparison to punitive systems such as zero tolerance, including discussion on school-wide positive behavior support effectiveness in multiple settings, teacher efficacy, and the ethical codes school-wide positive behavior support adheres to. And here's Dan.
Hey guys, my name is Dan Kulik, and I am the prover for the pro zero tolerance position. The first thing I wanted to touch on briefly is the ethical compliance code. In terms of the relationship between zero tolerance policies and the BACB compliance codes, I'd like to point to section 4.07, which calls for the identification and elimination of environmental conditions that hinder implementation of effective behavior change programs. So in the context of zero tolerance, what I'm referring to is the right of the majority of the student body to a safe and positive environment from a small minority of students who endanger the majority. The first major area I'd like to talk about involves some of the notable court cases and their rulings on zero tolerance. So overall, the vast majority of court cases that have looked at zero tolerance policies have upheld the rights of schools and districts to determine their own disciplinary policies. The first case that I'm going to talk about is Syed Elden versus Steiner, which was tried in 2012 in the New York Appellate Court. The incident involved a 9th grade student who threatened to blow up the school, and he was suspended from school for 25 days. And the student's father challenged the decision, saying the school had violated his First Amendment right to free speech by punishing him for a threat he never intended to carry out. The court ruled that whether or not the threat was serious was irrelevant, and that it was the disruption caused by his statements that was relevant. The disruption being the need to conduct a police investigation, conduct interviews of students, and the potential fear of parents and students when threatening statements are spread. The next case is JJX Rel Vantress versus Oak Grove School District, which occurred in 2008 in the U.S. District Court in San Jose, California. A male African-American student was accused of committing misdemeanor sexual battery of a female student. The student was suspended for 5 days, and the school attempted to expel him. The student's family appealed the school's decision and claims that racial discrimination had occurred, but the court ultimately ruled that discrimination did not occur under the district's zero tolerance policy and decided in favor of the school district. The third case, which is probably the biggest and most consequential, involves the U.S. Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has had the opportunity to accept cases that directly challenge zero tolerance policies, but have not chosen to do so. But in 2012, the Supreme Court did rule on a case involving a search of a student by school officials, and the dissenting opinion of Justice Clarence Thomas was relevant to the zero tolerance discussion. The case was Safford United School District number 1 versus Reading. It involved a student who was ruled to have been illegally searched under the Fourth Amendment by school officials, but the dissenting opinion from Justice Thomas argued that judges do not have a monopoly on common sense, and that the implementation of school policies is beyond the function of judges. So while schools are not entirely free to impose whatever rules they want, parents also have many ways to seek redress when rules are unreasonable. These include challenging school boards and legislators, sending their children to private schools, homeschooling their children, or just simply moving. So ultimately, the ruling suggests that parents, teachers, school administrators, local politicians, and state officials are in a much better position than the courts to determine the limits on searches by school officials. So overall, the courts have tended to side with the schools, upholding their authority and discretion to enforce policies which aim to protect students and staff from violence. So now I'm going to turn the focus to the opinions of some key people and groups in the discussion involving zero tolerance policies. First is Michael Resnick, who was the Associate Director for Advocacy and Issues Management for the National School Boards Association. He's quoted as saying, "We have to send a message that we're serious about guns and drugs. We can't be fuzzy around the edges about that message." Next, Vincent Ferrandino, who was the Executive Director of the National Association of Elementary School Principals, says that while a handful of silly cases make national headlines, most zero tolerance cases involve real weapons. He's quoted as saying, "These policies are meant to protect kids." He also says that zero tolerance doesn't provide for the kind of flexibility that would allow for the kind of racial and ethnic discrimination that could disproportionately target minorities, the poor, and the disabled. This was an argument that was actually also made by Reverend Jesse Jackson, who led protest marches in Illinois, protesting the expulsion of 6 African-American teenagers for starting a fight at a football game. And Reverend Jackson claimed that had those students been white, they never would have been expelled for engaging in a fight that had no weapons and no injuries. And the last quote is from Albert Shanker. He was the president of the American Federation of Teachers. He says that teachers and administrators have to draw a line and tell students they may not cross those lines. Without tough codes of conduct that are consistently enforced, the students will continue to do so. Next, I want to turn to some teacher opinions, and actually parent opinions too. So there was one study conducted at the Graduate College University of Wisconsin-Stout, which examined teachers' perceptions of zero tolerance policies. The author hypothesized that the majority of public school teachers would believe that zero tolerance policies were ineffective, that they would have a negative impact on students, and that the policies do not prevent school violence. But to the contrary, the findings revealed that teachers actually viewed zero tolerance policies as an effective means of school discipline, and also that the policies fulfilled the school's goals for reducing school violence, and overall the teachers thought the policies were beneficial. In another article published by the Manhattan Institute, a teacher advocates for zero tolerance and is quoted as saying, "There are no serious consequences for bad behavior, vulgar language, or rude treatment of teachers by students. The students run our school." So to me, that is really not the kind of environment you want to see in a school. Next, there was another study that looked at the attitudes of both teachers and students towards zero tolerance policies. It was a national survey that found that 70% of teachers and 68% of parents strongly support the establishment of zero tolerance policies for persistent troublemakers so that students know they will be kicked out of school for serious violations. Finally, I will cite one more study of the Granite City School District, which experienced a 50 to 75% decline in expulsions as a result of zero tolerance policies. So overall, in summary, it seems to me that zero tolerance policies have the support of our communities, including parents, teachers, administrators, and that these opinions have been bolstered by the rulings of our courts and criminal justice system. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who will talk about school-wide positive behavior supports.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike. I'm our group's prover for the argument in favor of school-wide positive behavior supports. So the evidence base in support of school-wide positive behavior supports is actually pretty solid, but it's also varied, and in some cases the results are even mixed or inconclusive. And that's because school-wide positive behavior supports are not just one thing, but many different things. There are the different tiers, which have been talked about. Interventions are usually custom targeted to specific problem areas, so what they look like from school to school can vary quite a bit. They're often implemented with varying degrees of fidelity as well, which can affect outcomes pretty dramatically. Horner, Sugai, and Anderson conducted a study in order to establish guidelines with which to assess school-wide positive behavior supports programs. And the authors point out that given the variation in the size, scope, breadth, and focus of these school-wide positive behavior supports, the evidence base is unwieldy at best. And such variability in the results, they argue, can leave the evidence base somewhat vulnerable to criticism from opponents. Solomon, Klein, Hintz, Cressy, and Peller sought to remedy this by systematically and quantitatively analyzing the results of several school-wide positive behavior supports studies in an attempt to generalize the success of these programs across the board. Similar to Horner et al., these authors argue that while there's an abundance of support for school-wide positive behavior supports, at the local level, such support might easily be dismissed as anecdotal. So in a meta-analysis, they analyzed 20 independent studies and found that, in general, school-wide positive behavior supports are indeed moderately effective in reducing problem behavior. So there was some generalizability there. Interestingly, they also found the effects of the interventions were most pronounced in settings where there was substantial room for improvement, such as in schools in more urban settings or in environments within schools that are more unstructured, like in lunchrooms, passing periods, recess, where there tends to be more problem behaviors. In other words, school-wide positive behavior supports are ideal for making improvements where improvements are needed most. One of the questions posed by our group by Dr. Kim had to do with the perspectives of stakeholders within the school, such as teachers. And one measure that answers this question fairly well is teacher efficacy. Teacher efficacy refers to how effective teachers believe themselves to be in motivating and educating all students, including the challenging ones. According to Caprara, Barbanelli, Stecca, and Malone, teacher efficacy as an independent variable can make a huge difference in student outcomes. On the dependent variable side, talking about school-wide positive behavior supports, in a study by Kelm and McIntosh, teacher efficacy in schools implementing school-wide positive behavior supports with a high degree of fidelity, they were found to have significantly greater, they were more self-efficacious in the schools with no such programs. What's compelling about this is that this runs counter to the argument that without being able to send kids to the office or suspend them or expel them, teachers can't teach because they have no effective control over their classrooms. Well, according to the teachers themselves, this is clearly not the case. Okay, now for some applicable ABA compliance codes and core ethical principles. I'm going to switch to a slide here. And by the way, another question posed to our group by Dr. Kim had to do with outcomes. Let me get this pulled up. Had to do with outcomes, and some of these will answer that, at least from the positive behavior supports side of the argument. Okay, so the first one here, do no harm. With school-wide positive behavior supports, harm is minimized through proper identification and treatment of the actual problems contributing to the behaviors. Students are treated in terms of their potential for success and independent living rather than the problems they present to the school. School-wide positive behavior supports ensure the right people benefit, not just those who might want to be rid of problem behaviors. And in identifying and treating the true sources of problem behaviors and their maintaining contingencies, school-wide positive behavior supports ensure we are being just. We accord dignity by recognizing the diversity of the students and their abilities and seeking to bring these students in rather than cast them out into some abyss. And in considering all the factors contributing to behavior, we're ensuring everyone involved is accepting their part in it. Most importantly, we're avoiding punishing individual students for environmental conditions that might be contributing to problem behavior, which is in effect unethical, actually. Okay, this next slide, under the applicable compliance codes, School-wide positive behavior supports are evidence-based, which ensures Code 1.01. They uphold the right to a free and appropriate education to all students to the greatest extent possible. That's 2.05. Efficacy is assured when the true sources of problem behavior are systematically identified, treated, monitored for progress, and then adjusted to ensure success, which is what school-wide positive behavior supports do. They're behavior analytic. I think that's self-evident. And 4.07 here, they're intervention. So environmental conditions are actually a major part of the assessment and the treatment. That is, they're taken into consideration as factors in the behavior and in the treatment. Least restrictive procedures are ensured to the greatest extent possible. Again, the intent is to keep kids in, not push them out like exclusionary practices do. Exclusionary practices, even though sometimes warranted, are actually highly restricted. Exclusionary practices being those tied in with zero tolerance policies. School-wide positive behavior supports, if implemented with a high degree of fidelity, will systematically remove the kind of bias from decision-making processes and interventions that often adversely affect people who are already disadvantaged. Okay, so that's it for me. I'm going to pass it back over to Dan and get out of this slide. Thanks.
Hey again, guys, it's Dan. So now I'm playing the role of the attacker of the pro-school-wide behavior, positive behavior supports argument and in favor of the zero tolerance argument. So I'll respond to the points that Mike made for the pro positive behavioral supports side in the order that he presented them. So first of all, I think it's possible that the opening statements made in favor of positive behavior supports can themselves actually be an argument in opposition of it, or opposition to it. The professional literature that looks at school-wide positive behavior supports are mixed, as Mike said, because unlike a lot of the specific behavioral strategies that a lot of us are already familiar with, school-wide positive behavioral supports are not a specifically prescribed treatment package. The approach is based on very general, loosely assembled three-tier system. And again, as the study that Mike cited, Horner, Sugai, and Anderson state in their discussion, they basically said that the evidence base was unwieldy at best. And I think some of these variable results stem from inconsistencies in the focus and application of positive behavioral supports. So one of the arguments against positive behavioral supports is that these inconsistent outcomes are the inevitable result of an approach that is inherently vague and inconsistent. Mike also made a point about teacher efficacy, which was, to my understanding, that teacher efficacy when implementing positive behavior supports was found to be variable. In other words, some teachers were effective in implementing school-wide positive behavioral supports and others were not. So to me, this is true of any teaching strategy and doesn't do a lot to support positive behavior support over the zero tolerance policies. A number of ethical principles were positioned in favor of positive behavioral supports, but again, I think the zero tolerance position would posit that these principles, in fact, do not support school-wide positive behavioral supports. The first was do no harm. So on this point, I'd like to highlight that it's the vast majority of students who are hardworking, diligent, intellectually curious, and that it's those students who are irreparably harmed by the small minority of dangerous students who terrorize schools and make it impossible for teachers and students to have a safe, positive learning experience. The public discourse often disproportionately highlights the grievances of this small minority of dangerous students under zero tolerance policies without giving a second thought to the vast majority of students who have to suffer at their hands, frankly. Another point I'd like to challenge is the idea of justice and that identifying the function or the maintaining contingencies of a behavior is the way to serve the interests of justice. The pro-zero tolerance position argues that this in no way prepares young people for the realities of life and the real world, particularly professional life, beyond the scope of secondary education. I don't think most of us as adults have had supervisors or bosses who try to determine the function of our lateness behavior, for instance, or our laziness behavior. Regardless of whether you're engaging in those behaviors for attention or for automatic reinforcement or to avoid an aversive vocational task, the result is likely that you're just going to get fired. So nobody in the real world really does an FBA to determine a treatment based on the function that produces what end up being poor results. And the pro-zero tolerance position would argue that it would actually be unjust to do so. This, I think, is relevant to another point that Mike brought up, which is the idea of not punishing people for some of the environmental conditions that they experience. Here, I think the pro-zero tolerance position would argue that it's not the role of the schools to control for the conditions of students outside of the educational context, and it would be impossible to do so anyway. The role of the schools is to provide a safe, positive learning environment to help prepare students to succeed in the real world. The conditions that schools can control are those within the boundaries of the school environment itself. Those are the relevant environmental conditions to this discussion, and zero tolerance policies promote conditions that are fair and safe for the students who behave in a responsible way. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over now to Isabel, who is the attacker for the school-wide positive behavioral supports position.
Hello, I'm Isabel, and I'm the attacker in favor of school-wide positive behavior supports and against zero tolerance policies. I'll be discussing the cons of zero tolerance, and we'll also be touching on some of the points mentioned here supporting zero tolerance. First, I want to briefly review the history of zero tolerance. So what do we know so far? The zero tolerance movement was first implemented in the 80s when state and federal efforts were made to combat drug abuse and serious crimes. 10 years later, school systems began to use zero tolerance policies against weapons in school, and as Lacey mentioned earlier, Congress signed the Guns Free School Act. This act also made it a requirement for schools to adopt the zero tolerance policies if they wanted to receive federal funding, which basically made it mandatory. Over the last couple decades, zero tolerance policies began to encompass much more than just drugs, weapons, and serious crime. According to research done by Robbers in 2013, out of all of the disciplinary actions taken nationally, only 5% involved a weapon. The policy started to focus on completely removing troublemakers and criminalizing them, rather than improving the behavior by using more appropriate disciplinary measures like losing recess, detention, or being assigned additional schoolwork. Zero tolerance doesn't take into account for function of the behavior, so suspending a student who doesn't want to be at school will only reinforce their behavior. And this leads to the efficacy of zero tolerance. In 2013, the Vera Institute of Justice completed a review of existing research on the policy and concluded it has not accomplished its goal of making schools safer and has in fact made schools less safe. In addition, according to a study by Bickel and Qualls, removing disruptive students does not improve school environment and actually has the opposite effect in that schools that have lower rates of suspension and expulsion have higher satisfactory ratings from the perspective of administrators, teachers, and students. Now I'm going to talk about some ideas that were used to support zero tolerance. First, let's talk about some of Dan's arguments. First of all, his arguments supporting zero tolerance are heavily reliant on anecdotal quotes from over 15 years ago, whereas there's conclusive evidence that zero tolerance is not effective found within the last 5 years and was still being published in 2016. In addition, the court cases he mentioned don't provide any evidence that zero tolerance is effective. It only stated that the court sided with the school's disciplinary actions, but didn't mention anything about efficacy or how that ruling made a difference in the behavior. For example, regarding the case with the student who threatened to blow up the school, if he actually was going to carry out that act, suspending him wouldn't necessarily stop him. Another argument is that there's the notion that zero tolerance is unbiased and fair. It's the idea that because zero tolerance is a clear-cut, no gray area, you either violated the policy or you didn't, kind of disciplinary action, it removes any subjective influences or contextual factors. However, evidence shows otherwise. According to research done by the American Psychological Association Zero Tolerance Task Force in 2008, there's disproportionate discipline of students of color, and there is an overrepresentation in suspension or expulsion found for African American students, which there's no evidence to support that they're exhibiting higher rates of disruption or violence. Here's a graph showing the relative risk ratios of students experiencing a few different disciplinary actions by race. So the graph shows the national estimate for the relative risk ratio of Native American, Hispanic, and African American students compared to white students in 2002 and 2003. It shows the relative risk ratio of the target group index compared with the risk index on the same measure for white students. A risk ratio of 1 indicates exact proportionality, and that's shown as the black horizontal line. Ratios above that line indicate overrepresentation in the selected discipline. As you can see in this graph, all three races are overrepresented in relation to the risk ratio, with African American students being the most overrepresented. And just last year, Koran found that racial minorities and Black students in particular have been shown to experience severe forms of school discipline at greater rates than their white peers. So not much has changed between 2002 and 2016. I also wanted to mention that Heilbronn and Cornell have found that racial disparities in school suspension could reflect discriminatory practices that are in violation of federal law, which ties into the Compliance Code 1.04D, which states that behavior analysts' behavior conforms to the legal and ethical codes of the communities that they're part of. And the discrimination doesn't end with race either. Students with disabilities such as emotional or behavior disorders appear to be suspended or expelled at disproportionate rates as well. In 2014, Lazinski, Katianis, Ryan, and Boffin found that in one school year, over 552,000 students with disabilities were suspended or expelled for 10 days or less, and almost 76,000 were suspended or expelled for more than 10 days. That's well over 500,000 students. And these facts are in direct violation of Compliance Code 2.09, which outlines the right to effective treatment based on professional research and individualized to the client's need. And because zero tolerance is not supported by professional research and is not individualized in any way, zero tolerance does not meet this ethical standard. Another strong point support for zero tolerance is that Lacey mentioned is the swift and certain punishment that acts as a deterrent to students. However, in 2008, the APA Zero Tolerance Task Force found that rather than reducing the likelihood of disruption, school suspension in general appears to predict higher rates of misbehavior and suspension among those students who are suspended, and in the long run is associated with a higher likelihood of dropping out and failing to graduate on time, which in turn could affect employment and quality of living. The final point I want to cast my rebuttal on was the argument that there is large parental support for zero tolerance. The data on this topic is actually inconclusive. There are accounts that suggest parents are in favor of these disciplinary actions, but there are also accounts that the community surrounding schools react highly negatively to it as well. So there's no substantial evidence to support the argument that parents are overwhelmingly in favor of zero tolerance. That's it from me, and now we're back to Lacey.
Thank you, Isabel. While there is debate regarding zero tolerance policies in schools, the bottom line is safety. A small number of students cannot be allowed to endanger the rest of the student body. The psychological impacts of an unsafe environment can last a lifetime and must be prevented. It is necessary to provide students with clear expectations and universal consequences. This has resulted in the decline of the number of victimizations of students in school and must be continued. While ideally an FBA would be conducted for every student, health and safety must be made a priority. This may include removing students from the environment until it is safe for them to return. The American justice system has held up zero tolerance again and again because the rules are fair and safety must be maintained above all else. I will now hand it back over to Felicia to wrap up the school-wide positive behavior support argument.
I am going to briefly reflect and sum up some of the major points that were discussed during this debate. First off, in regards to zero tolerance, research has found removing children from the school is not an effective approach and does not keep our schools any safer. Instead, we've just had skyrocketing suspension rates that impact students' academic success. Although zero tolerance policies were originally intended to impose the same harsh consequences on all students, thereby reducing disparities, that is not what has happened. Statistics have shown zero tolerance targets minority students, specifically African Americans. Research has also shown students with disabilities are also impacted as well. Zero tolerance also doesn't comply to many ethical codes and core principles. We have provided many points throughout the debate that proves not only is school-wide positive behavior support an effective intervention, but also a more ethical intervention than zero tolerance. School-wide positive behavior support adheres to compliance codes and supports the core principles. School-wide positive behavior support does no harm, ensures autonomy, and accords dignity. I think Mike said it best when he stated we accord dignity by recognizing the diversity of the students and their abilities and seeking to bring students in rather than cast them out into some abyss. Now let's reflect on some of the differences between positive behavior support and punitive system and how that might impact the effectiveness of the interventions. A major difference between the two interventions we discussed is school-wide behavior support is proactive, where zero tolerance waits until after the behavior occurs. The purpose of school-wide positive behavior support is to establish a climate in which appropriate behavior is the norm. School-wide positive behavior support focuses to make sure all students are getting support, not just the ones who are displaying problem behavior. Introducing, modeling, and reinforcing positive social behavior is an important step of a student's educational experience. In conclusion, teaching behavioral expectations and rewarding students for following them is a much more positive approach than waiting for misbehavior to occur before responding. And that's our conclusion to our debate.